Welcome to Brainwaves. Today, we'll be exploring the fascinating history of countries that no longer exist. Many of these countries were once great powers, but are now largely forgotten. We'll be taking a deep dive into the reasons behind their downfall, the impact it had on the world, and what remains of them today. Yugoslavia was a country in southeastern Europe that existed from 1918 until its dissolution in 1992. The country was formed after World War I, as a result of the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It was made up of a number of different ethnic groups including Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, who all wanted to live together in a unified state. In an effort to create this state, a conference was held in 1919 and a new country was formed. The country was originally called the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, but it was later changed to Yugoslavia, which means, Land of the Southern Slavs. The capital of Yugoslavia was Belgrade, which is still the capital of Serbia today. As the country grew, it added additional territories and countries, including Bosnia and Herzegovina, Croatia, Macedonia, Montenegro, and Slovenia, among others. Despite the various ethnicities that made up Yugoslavia, the country remained relatively stable until the late 1980s. Although Yugoslavia was initially stable, tensions between the different ethnic groups began to rise in the 1980s. The country's economy was struggling, and the government was unable to provide the various regions of Yugoslavia with the resources they needed to be successful. Additionally, nationalist movements were growing in strength, causing many to question the legitimacy of the Yugoslav government. These movements called for greater autonomy or independence for their specific regions. In response, the Yugoslav government sought to suppress these movements, leading to protests and violence. The tension between the regions and the central government came to a head in 1991, when Slovenia and Croatia declared independence. This move led to a decade of conflict in the region, as different regions fought for independence and control. The conflict ultimately led to the dissolution of Yugoslavia and the formation of several new countries, including Bosnia and Herzegovina, Croatia, Macedonia, Montenegro, Serbia, and Slovenia. The fall of Yugoslavia was one of the most significant events in Europe in the 20th century, and its legacy continues to impact the region today. The dissolution of Yugoslavia was a complex and violent process that spanned most of the 1990s. The nationalist movements that had caused tensions in the 1980s had become more militant in the early 1990s, leading to armed conflict between different regions and ethnic groups. The conflict was characterized by widespread atrocities committed against civilians, including massacres, ethnic cleansing, and other war crimes. The international community became involved in the conflict, with NATO conducting airstrikes against Serbia in 1995, and the United Nations establishing a peacekeeping force in the region. Despite peace agreements being signed and ceasefires being declared, the conflict continued to drag on until the end of the decade. Finally, in 1999, NATO launched a 78-day bombing campaign against Yugoslavia, which led to the withdrawal of Yugoslav forces from Kosovo. The end of the conflict led to the formal dissolution of Yugoslavia in 2003, with the former republics becoming independent countries. The legacy of the conflict is felt throughout the region even today, with many still grappling with the consequences of the war. In 1918, the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire allowed for the creation of Czechoslovakia. The new country was formed by the joining of Czech territories and Slovakia, which were previously part of Austro-Hungary. This newly formed country was a republic and it quickly became one of the most prosperous countries in Central Europe. The first president of Czechoslovakia was Tomáš Garrigue Masaryk, who held the position from 1918 to 1935. The country's constitution was one of the most progressive in the world at the time, guaranteeing civil liberties and democratic rights to its citizens. During World War II, Czechoslovakia was occupied by Nazi Germany. The country was divided into different regions, each controlled by different levels of German authority. Resistance movements in Czechoslovakia were active throughout the war, with one of the most notable moments being the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich, a high-ranking Nazi official. This assassination led to the brutal crackdown of Czech and Slovak citizens by the Nazis, and many civilians were executed, imprisoned or deported to concentration camps. The war had a devastating impact on Czechoslovakia, leaving the country in ruins with much of its infrastructure destroyed. The Velvet Divorce of 1993 marked the end of Czechoslovakia as a country. The breakup of the country was largely peaceful, with the two regions of Czechs and Slovaks agreeing to divide into two independent states. The main reasons for this decision were economic and political differences between the two regions. The Czechs were more prosperous and wanted a more centralized government, while the Slovaks favored more autonomy. The Velvet Divorce was a remarkable example of peaceful transition to independence, with both parties successfully negotiating their separation. On January 1, 1993, the Czech Republic and Slovakia became independent, sovereign states. In the aftermath of World War II, Germany was divided into four zones, which were controlled by the victorious Allied powers. The Soviet Union controlled the Eastern Zone, while the Western zones were controlled by the United States, Great Britain, and France. In 1949, the Soviet Union and its allies declared the establishment of the German Democratic Republic, GDR, which was also commonly known as East Germany. The GDR was formally created on October 7, 1949, with Wilhelm Pieck as its president and Otto Grotewohl as its prime minister. The country was created as a response to the establishment of West Germany, which was created by the Western Allies. East Germany was ruled by a single party, the Socialist Unity Party, SED, which was heavily influenced by the Soviet Union. The country was established as a socialist state where the means of production were owned and controlled by the state. The economy of East Germany was planned, with production targets set by the state. The GDR was a highly centralized state, with power concentrated in the hands of the ruling party. Life in East Germany was characterized by severe restrictions on personal and political freedoms. The ruling Socialist Unity Party, SED, maintained strict control over all aspects of life in the country. The Stasi, the secret police force, monitored the population closely, and informers were everywhere. The lack of freedom of expression made it difficult for people to voice their opinions and led to a culture of fear. Economic conditions in East Germany were generally poor, particularly compared to the more prosperous West Germany. People faced food and supply shortages, and consumer goods were often inferior in quality. Despite these challenges, the government of East Germany heavily promoted the idea that they were building a prosperous and equitable society. Public spaces were adorned with propaganda posters extolling the virtues of socialism, and politicians delivered speeches promising a bright future. In reality, however, the government's policies stifled innovation and economic growth, leading to a general sense of malaise and dissatisfaction among the population. In the late 1980s, protests erupted across East Germany, with citizens demanding greater freedom and an end to the communist regime. These protests were met with violence from the government, but they continued to grow in size and intensity. In November 1989, the Berlin Wall, which had separated East and West Berlin since 1961, was torn down. This event became a symbol of the end of the Cold War and the division of Germany. East and West Germany were officially reunified on October 3, 1990, and the German Democratic Republic ceased to exist. The fall of East Germany was a watershed moment in European history, marking the end of the Soviet Union's dominance over Eastern Europe and the beginning of a new era of cooperation and integration. The Soviet Union was a vast socialist state that existed from 1922 to 1991. It was situated in the northern part of Eurasia and spanned an incredible 22 million square kilometers, making it the largest country in the world by land area. It was also one of the most populous countries, with a population of about 293 million people at its peak. The capital city was Moscow, and the Soviet Union's official language was Russian. The Soviet Union was a federal socialist state that was composed of 15 republics, each of which had its own government and was represented in the central government of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was a one-party state. The Communist Party held a monopoly on political power and controlled every aspect of Soviet life. The Soviet Union was a superpower during the Cold War, and its sphere of influence extended to nearly every corner of the globe. It was also the first country to put a man in space, and it was known for its nuclear and military prowess. Despite its size and power, the Soviet Union was plagued by a number of problems, including economic stagnation, political corruption, and chronic shortages of food and other necessities. Ultimately, these problems would contribute to the Soviet Union's collapse in 1991. The Russian Revolution of 1917 was a major catalyst for the establishment of the Soviet Union. The revolution overthrew the Tsarist autocracy and the provisional government that replaced it, paving the way for the Bolsheviks to seize power. The Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, were a radical socialist party that aimed to transform Russia into a socialist state. They established a new government, known as the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, and began implementing policies aimed at improving the lives of the working class. The Bolsheviks nationalized land, banks, and major industries, like oil and coal. They also instituted policies aimed at increasing literacy and improving public health. In 1922, the Soviet Union was officially established, bringing together the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, the Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic, and the Transcaucasian Socialist Federative Soviet Republic. The Soviet Union would go on to experience significant political and economic upheaval in the years to come, but the Bolsheviks' establishment of socialism and their revolutionary zeal were critical to its founding and early development. Joseph Stalin became the leader of the Soviet Union shortly after Lenin's death in 1924. Stalin believed that the Soviet Union needed to modernize and industrialize quickly in order to compete with capitalist countries. He implemented the first five-year plan in 1928, which aimed to rapidly increase industrial output by nationalizing farms and forcing peasants to work in factories. The five-year plan was a success in terms of increasing industrial output and consolidating the Soviet Union's power, but it led to widespread famine and suffering among the peasantry. Stalin also implemented purges aimed at removing perceived enemies of the state. These purges led to the deaths of millions of people, including many high-ranking members of the Communist Party. In addition to these political policies, Stalin also implemented a command economy, which meant that the government controlled all aspects of the economy, including production and distribution. This led to inefficiencies and chronic shortages of consumer goods. Despite this, the Soviet Union continued to modernize and develop, becoming a major world power. The Soviet Union and the United States were the two dominant world powers after World War II. The United States and its Western allies formed NATO, while the Soviet Union and its allies formed the Warsaw Pact. Despite not engaging in any direct military conflict, the United States and the Soviet Union engaged in a decades-long struggle known as the Cold War. The Cold War was marked by intense ideological and political conflict, in which both sides sought to spread their influence and undermine each other's power. The arms race between the two countries was a significant aspect of the Cold War. Both the United States and the Soviet Union developed and tested increasingly powerful nuclear weapons, leading to a dangerous standoff that threatened global security. The Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 brought the world to the brink of nuclear war, as the Soviet Union deployed missiles to Cuba in response to a U.S. deployment of missiles in Turkey. The crisis was ultimately resolved peacefully, but it underscored the danger of the arms race. Despite the danger, the arms race continued throughout the Cold War, with both sides investing heavily in weapons development and production. By the end of the Cold War, the Soviet Union had collapsed, in part due to economic strain caused by the arms race. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 was a pivotal event in world history. The immediate cause of the collapse was a combination of political and economic factors. Gorbachev's reforms, known as perestroika and glasnost, aimed to restructure the Soviet economy and political system. These policies loosened state control over the economy and introduced elements of democracy and freedom of speech. However, the reforms also led to greater political instability and economic insecurity. Additionally, the Soviet Union spent vast amounts of money on its military and arms race with the United States, draining its resources and causing economic strain. Finally, a series of popular uprisings throughout the Soviet Empire, along with nationalist movements within the constituent republics, put significant pressure on the central government. On December 25, 1991, Gorbachev resigned as leader of the Soviet Union, and the country officially dissolved, leading to the formation of new independent states. The collapse of the Soviet Union was a major turning point in world history, marking the end of the Cold War and the emergence of a new world order. The legacy of the Soviet Union is complex and multifaceted. Despite its many failures and flaws, the Soviet Union was a major global power that made significant contributions to science, culture, and human rights. The Soviet Union was a pioneer in space exploration, putting the first satellite, animal, and human in space. Soviet literature, art, music, and film had a lasting impact on world culture. Additionally, the Soviet Union played a critical role in defeating Nazi Germany during World War II, and its sacrifices in the war must be remembered. However, the Soviet Union was also responsible for many human rights abuses, including political repression, censorship, and forced labor. The legacy of Soviet communism is still being felt today in the countries that were once part of the Soviet bloc. Many of these countries are still struggling to overcome the legacy of poverty, political repression, and corruption that characterized Soviet-era governance. Additionally, the global balance of power was profoundly affected by the Soviet Union's rise and fall. The Soviet Union's collapse led to a unipolar world order dominated by the United States, which has had significant effects on global politics, economics, and culture. In conclusion, the legacy of the Soviet Union is a complicated mix of achievements and failures, and its influence on the world will continue to be felt for many years to come. Tibet, also known as the Roof of the World, is a plateau region located in Asia. The area is surrounded by some of the world's highest mountain ranges, including the Himalayas. Tibet is primarily known for its unique culture, religion, and history. The history of Tibet is said to date back to the Neolithic period, where early humans inhabited the region. The first written records of Tibet date back to the 7th century, during the time of the Tibetan Empire. During this time, Tibet was a powerful kingdom and had strong ties with China, India, and other neighboring countries. The Tibetan Empire lasted for over 50 years before it collapsed, resulting in a period of fragmentation and frequent invasions from neighboring kingdoms. Tibet eventually unified in the 9th century under the rule of the Yarlung dynasty. The Yarlung dynasty was the longest ruling dynasty in Tibetan history and is credited with the early spread of Buddhism in Tibet. In the 13th century, Tibet was conquered by the Mongol Empire and later fell under the rule of the Chinese Ming dynasty in the 14th century. The Ming dynasty maintained significant control over Tibet for over 200 years, with the Tibetan people rebelling occasionally but to no avail. This period of Ming dynasty rule eventually came to an end in 1644. Following this, Tibet was able to reassert some control but was met with increased pressure from the Chinese Qing dynasty in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. The Dalai Lamas were spiritual and political leaders of Tibet for more than 4 centuries. The first Dalai Lama was declared the spiritual leader of Tibet in the 15th century, while the 5th Dalai Lama became the political leader of Tibet in the 17th century. Under the leadership of the Dalai Lamas, Tibet became a unified theocracy with a centralized government. The power of the Dalai Lama extended beyond Tibet and was recognized by many neighboring countries. During the rule of the 13th Dalai Lama, Tibet experienced significant modernization and reforms, such as the establishment of a medical school and a modern army. However, Tibetan society remained largely feudal and agrarian, with most of the population living in poverty. The 14th and the last Dalai Lama, Tenzin Gyatso, was born in 1935 and assumed the title at the age of 15. Under his leadership, Tibet continued its modernization efforts, but the tensions between Tibet and China increased. In 1950, China invaded Tibet, and the Dalai Lama went into exile in India in 1959. Although the Dalai Lama does not hold any political power over Tibet at present, he remains an important spiritual leader for Tibetans both in and outside of their home country. China's invasion of Tibet in 1950 marked a turning point in Tibetan history. In 1950, the People's Liberation Army of China marched into Tibet, claiming socialist reform and unification with China. However, the Chinese invasion was met with resistance from Tibetans, who who resented the outsiders' intervention in their country. After a failed attempt at negotiating with the Chinese government, the Dalai Lama led a non-violent resistance movement, which eventually escalated into an armed conflict between Tibetans and Chinese soldiers. The Chinese crackdown on protesters and critics of the government became increasingly severe, and many Tibetans were killed, tortured, or imprisoned. The situation worsened, and the Dalai Lama was forced to flee Tibet in 1959 due to threats to his life by the Chinese government. The Chinese began implementing policies designed to integrate Tibet into China as a province, including the destruction of monasteries and the suppression of Tibetan culture and language. With the current situation in Tibet remaining controversial, Tibetans around the world continue to campaign for autonomy and human rights. And that's a wrap on our exploration of countries that no longer exist. As we've learned, the rise and fall of these nations have had a profound impact on our world today, from changing borders to affecting global politics. While these countries may no longer be on the map, their legacies continue to shape our world. It's important to remember the stories of these countries and the lessons we can learn from them. We hope you enjoyed our video, and don't forget to leave a comment below about which country you found most interesting.